In 18th and 19th century Europe, it was common to entrust newborns to wet nurses. While this might conjure images of happy, cared-for infants, the reality was often grim. Many children suffered and died under deplorable conditions. This video explores the tragic fate of these children and the systemic issues that led to their suffering. If you find this video interesting, please support us by hitting the like button. Now, let's get started. Wet nurses may not be a familiar concept today, but they played a very important role in 18th century Europe. Although it was over 200 years ago, the duties of wet nurses did not differ significantly from what we might imagine today. Changing diapers, playing with the child, and taking care of the baby in place of the mother were among their responsibilities. The most important task was to breastfeed the baby. People of that time, especially the upper class, sought wet nurses not only to take care of the child, but also because society required someone to breastfeed in place of the mother. However, entrusting child rearing to a wet nurse required finding a reliable one first. How did people find wet nurses back then? In Paris, the hiring of wet nurses was completely institutionalized. And until the 1860s, there was a state-run wet nurse employment office in a place called Saint Apolline. The history of this facility is old. It is said that as early as 1184, there was already a wet nurse employment office in Paris. Visiting this office was the standard for those wanting to hire a wet nurse. However, not all families followed this practice. Wealthy families often did not use the employment office. Instead, they found wet nurses directly through acquaintances such as doctors or midwives who attended the birth. Wet nurses were entrusted with the lives of children. Therefore, their health and personality were of utmost importance, making introductions from trusted sources preferable. There were roughly two types of wet nurses: the take-home wet nurse, who cared for the child at her own home, and the live-in wet nurse, who worked and lived in the employer's home. In Paris, out of 21,000 babies born each year, 20,000 were entrusted to wet nurses, with 1,000 being live-in wet nurses and 19,000 being take-home wet nurses. The working conditions of the two types of wet nurses were vastly different. The take-home wet nurses, who often worked for middle-class or lower households, faced challenging conditions. Families that were not wealthy could not afford to hire servants exclusively for the wet nurse or provide carriages for outings. Additionally, while live-in wet nurses earned a monthly salary of 40 to 60 francs, take-home wet nurses averaged around 15 francs. However, both types of wet nurses often received indirect benefits. For instance, it was common for take-home wet nurses to request clothing or other items from the baby's parents by saying, "If you give me this, I will take better care of the baby." It seems both live-in and take-home wet nurses were similarly mercenary. However, the experience of a baby with a live-in wet nurse was entirely different from one with a take-home wet nurse. Living with a somewhat demanding live-in wet nurse likely felt like heaven compared to being entrusted to a take-home wet nurse. Many babies left with take-home wet nurses were placed in unimaginably harsh conditions. Next, we will look into these tragic realities in detail. As mentioned earlier, by the 18th century, the demand for wet nurses had expanded to the middle class, including merchants and craftsmen in Paris. However, unlike the upper class, they did not have acquaintances to introduce them to wet nurses. This need led to the rise of brokers who connected wet nurses with clients, i.e., the wet nurse employment offices. These offices were managed by several women known as brokers, who used about 40 to 50 subcontractors known as carriers. The carriers gathered information on wet nurses from rural midwives. At this time, midwives were paid a set fee for each wet nurse. The carriers traveled around rural areas to gather wet nurses, transported them to Paris, and sent them back to the countryside once they found a baby. However, for babies, the start of this new life was akin to the beginning of a nightmare. First, the conduct of the carriers was appalling. The carriers prioritized efficiency over the health of the babies. They crammed 20 wet nurses and babies into one carriage, along with coal, iron, and other goods. Naturally, the journey was grueling, with no proper rest breaks, and the carriages ran day and night. Consequently, accidents such as wet nurses falling asleep from fatigue and suffocating the babies, or babies dying from illness, were rampant. According to records from that time, a large number of nannies and babies were crammed into carriages, without even a roof to protect them from the rain and wind. Some had to walk alongside because they couldn't fit into the carriages. The babies, exposed to the cold, heat, and wind, received only a small amount of breast milk from the exhausted nannies. Weak children couldn't endure such conditions and lost their lives within a few days of departure. Reports from the police in Lyon and Paris document numerous cases of babies dying or going missing due to the actions of transporters. For example, one transporter fell asleep while carrying 6 babies in a carriage and didn't notice when one fell out and died. In another instance, a transporter left one of the 7 babies he was carrying somewhere and never found it again. There were even cases where transporters received 3 children but forgot where to take them. Many of these transporters were rough individuals blinded by money. As a result, it was common for them to cheat on wages or delay payments, and they cared little about the health of the babies and nannies. The accounting at the agencies was a mess, and the sanitary conditions inside the transporters' vehicles were atrocious. These transporters, who dominated the system of take-home nannies, were heartless individuals who disregarded the lives of babies. Many babies lost their lives because they couldn't withstand the harsh environment of being crammed into overcrowded carriages, exposed to the wind, and deprived of adequate food. In response to this situation, the government took measures to address the issue. But did these measures manage to change this tragic state of affairs? In 1821, a government-led investigation revealed the dire state of the agencies. As a result, transporters were immediately expelled, and the agencies were placed under the management of officials responsible for health and hygiene. Furthermore, doctors were mandated to be stationed at the agencies to closely monitor the health of the babies and nannies. The government aimed to prevent a recurrence of such tragic events by properly managing the agencies. However, this attempt at nationalization was a complete failure. The dismissed transporters quickly set up private agencies, drawing customers away from the state-run agencies. The officials managing the state-run agencies didn't have the connections with midwives that the transporters did, leading to a significant drop in the number of registered nannies. In 1821, there were over 5,000 registered nannies, but by 1828, this number had fallen below 2,000. Meanwhile, the number of nannies registered with private agencies continued to grow. One major advantage of private agencies was their connections with midwives, making it easier for customers to find the nannies they sought. At that time, parents wanted nannies who were from rural areas near Paris, so they could easily visit their fostered children. Private agencies, often run by former transporters, had many such nannies, leading customers to prefer private over state-run agencies. That doesn't mean no one used the state-run agencies. The customers of the state-run agencies were lower middle-class mothers who were so poor they couldn't afford to pay decent wages. This meant the state-run agencies could only hire low-level nannies willing to work for minimal pay. One reason for this situation was the lack of connections with midwives, as mentioned earlier. Another important reason was money. Due to accounting fraud and poor management, the state-run agencies prohibited the receipt of indirect wages. However, indirect wages were a vital source of income for nannies. Without indirect wages, many nannies protested, while private agencies run by former transporters allowed nannies to receive these payments. Naturally, the nannies chose the private agencies, leaving only low-quality nannies willing to work for minimal pay at the state-run agencies. Thus, the nationalization of the agencies did not bring fundamental changes to the take-home nanny system, but merely led to the rise of private agencies, failing to improve the harsh conditions surrounding the children. So, what kind of harsh fate did the children of that time face in such a terrible environment? Fostered babies faced unimaginably harsh conditions. Medical books from the 19th century contain descriptions like this. It was not uncommon to see visibly filthy old women. Some had been in this job for 20 to 30 years, unable to provide sufficient milk for the children due to their shriveled breasts. Their language was rough, and their demeanor was crude, making one deeply concerned about the fate of children entrusted to such people. Additionally, it was common to encounter children who had suffered violence. These women spent most of their days working in fields far from home, leaving the babies neglected. During this time, the babies' diapers were not changed, and they were left in their filth, constantly bitten by mosquitoes. The milk they received was poor in quality, coming from the overworked, exhausted nannies. Furthermore, due to their poverty, many of these nannies were in poor nutritional health and often transmitted illnesses. Naturally, under such conditions, the mortality rate of fostered babies was astonishingly high. A survey in 1875 reported that the mortality rate reached as high as 71%. By contrast, the average infant mortality rate across France in the late 19th century was 17.9%. The mortality rate among fostered babies was alarmingly high. Gilbert, a doctor at the time, noted that in Lyon, 2/3 of fostered children died within a year. Thus, babies sent to foster care faced poor hygiene, malnutrition, and the threat of disease, leading to many of their deaths. This was one of the great dark aspects of society at that time. However, there were families who experienced even deeper darkness, those so impoverished that they couldn't afford to hire even the lowest paid nannies. The mothers in these families could not afford nannies at all, and their only option was to abandon their babies. In Paris, until 1860, there were facilities called foundling homes, where abandoned babies were taken in by nuns around the clock. The health of the children who arrived at these facilities was generally poor. Records from 1828 show that 5,721 children were taken in, of whom 4,095 died. The few children who survived were then sent to nannies under the financial aid of the city of Paris. Unsurprisingly, the quality of these nannies was the lowest. Some nannies, driven by greed, took in as many as 22 babies at a time and operated what could be described as baby barns, akin to pigsties. Thus, children born into the poorest families, who couldn't even afford to hire nannies, also faced harsh fates. Severe poverty and inadequate care from low-quality nannies left them with little chance of survival. From the 18th to the 19th century, French society relied on families needing nannies and women earning their living by becoming nannies. However, the ones who suffered were the innocent children. Many of them lost their lives due to poor care environments. The nanny system was perhaps one of the distortions created by the social structure of that time. The inability of parents to devote themselves to childcare, the disparity in care environments caused by wealth gaps, and the tragedies befalling the children highlight the dark aspects of that era. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more insightful content. Take care and see you in the next video. Goodbye.